The Houston Texans finished the 2024 season with a 10-7 record and made the playoffs for the second straight year, and they also won their division for the second straight year. And anytime you can go from the number 2 pick in the draft and ultimately winning a Week 18 game to lose a critical draft pick in the final week of the 2022 season, the way the Texans did, and seemingly one of the worst situations in football, to back-to-back division titles, you would think it's mostly sunshine and rainbows, and in some ways it is, as they have not one but 2 playoff wins in the CJ Stroud era, and good for them. Texans fans truly went through it all between 2020 and the time CJ Stroud arrived, but that doesn't fix everything, and at this particular point in time, I have a lot of concerns with the Houston Texans, and more specifically, the way they're building their football team. Now, I do want to preface that they are doing a lot of things right as a franchise, and that I'm not predicting their downfall or anything like that, not even close. But in terms of building a championship caliber football team and taking the next step as a franchise, this is where I have concerns with the Texans, and in today's video, we're going to break everything down, and there is a lot to break down, so without further ado, let's begin. And we are starting today's video by discussing the Texans offense and discussing what went right and what went wrong in 2024. I think one of the biggest surprises in 2024 was how good Joe Mixon was in his first year with the team. He had over 1,300 total yards in 14 games and had 7 100-yard rushing games. And I know this is kind of nitpicking here to make Joe look even better, but he didn't play much in the regular season finale as he only had 5 carries for 23 yards, so my point is, he was a really good player for Houston in 2024, and obviously with the Texans' success in 2023, and even with them winning a playoff game over the Browns during CJ Stroud's rookie year, the hype entering the 2024 season was going to create lofty expectations, especially when the Texans traded for multiple-time Pro Bowler Stefon Diggs. Now, one thing I do want to note specifically about the Texans from last year is you cannot control injury. That not only applies to the Texans, but for every other NFL team too. Stefon Diggs only played 8 games for the Texans before sustaining a season-ending injury as he tore his ACL, and unfortunately Tank Dell had a severe knee injury near the end of the season that is expected to keep him out for most, if not all, of the 2025 season. And I genuinely feel bad for Tank Dell as he's had a tremendously tough stretch in each of his first 2 years, and I wish him the best moving forward. Nico Collins also missed some time during the 2024 season as he played in 12 of 17 games, and the point is, injuries are going to happen. You can't control that, but what you can control is the wall you build around your quarterback. Now, I don't want to get too much into the Laremy Tunsil discussion because there is 4 other positions along the offensive line, and the Texans' offensive line's success does not solely rely on Laremy Tunsil not being there in 2025. I will note that he was credited with 19 penalties during the 2024 season, and that's per PFF, and he had 6 penalties in the Minnesota game in Week 3 alone. And there was a point in that game where the Texans had 3rd and 4 in field goal range, but they committed 3 straight false start penalties to push it back to 3rd and 19, and to be clear, Tunsil committed 1 of the false start penalties, not all 3, but even when it was 3rd and 19, Tunsil committed an illegal formation penalty and Houston had to punt the ball away. If you want to replace a player who committed seemingly a drive-killing penalty, or even 2 at times, per game, that also had questions about effort, then go for it. But I do have questions about guys like a 33-year-old Laken Tomlinson, who is probably serviceable at best, and I definitely have questions about a 32-year-old Trent Brown, who is coming off of a torn patellar tendon, which is in the knee. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I'm a doctor, and I'm definitely not going to pretend that I know how Trent is doing in recovery, but to have him slated to be the starting right tackle at the moment, coming off of a year in which CJ Stroud struggled at times, due in large part to the offensive line and a revolving door at receiver, is concerning to me. Cam Robinson is slated to be the left tackle, and everyone talks about Sam Darnold's struggles in Week 18 and ultimately the wild card round for Minnesota last year, but Cam Robinson struggled just as much, if not more. He had 101 pass blocking snaps between Week 18 and the wild card round, and he allowed 21 pressures in those 2 games, which is awful. And for reference, he had allowed just 18 pressures on his previous 259 pass blocking snaps in the 7 games leading up to Week 18 against Detroit and the wild card game against Los Angeles. All of this to say, I know there were some Texans fans upset about the idea of trading away Laremy Tunsil, and I get it, but I have a lot more concerns with this team and ultimately this offensive line before Laremy Tunsil is even factored in. Whether Laramie Tunsil was on the 2025 Texans roster or not, the main concern that I have with the 2025 Texans offensive line remains the same, and it's that I don't think they're good enough to compete when it becomes hell or high water in the playoffs against teams that have elite pass rushes. And whether the quarterback in 2024 behind the Texans offensive line was CJ Stroud, or whether it was any of the big four in the AFC, whether it's Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, or Patrick Mahomes, there were times where CJ Stroud did not stand a chance. And obviously, when you look at CJ's numbers from his rookie season, when he threw 23 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, to, in theory, regressing to 20 touchdowns to 12 interceptions, a lot of people don't factor in the sacks that he took in 2024, and there were times where he didn't stand a chance, and it was downright frustrating to watch because I'm not exaggerating, there were multiple plays, not just one, but multiple and ultimately several throughout the season where within a second and a half, there was not just pressure in CJ's face, but there were multiple players meeting at the quarterback. One other thing heading into 2025 that I hope improves is Bobby Slowick not being the offensive coordinator, and Texans fans know this, but a lot of people may not know this, but there was a lot of chatter about CJ Stroud not being able to alter pass protections, and that it was basically Bobby Slowick was saying, hey, this is what's being called, you have to run this type of situation, which I don't think is healthy to begin with, but there's also one play in particular that Texans fans remember well from the 2024 season, and one other fan base as well because of how good of a play it was, but I don't think this play would happen in 2025 based on what we are hearing from the Bobby Slowick era, or from what happened during the Bobby Slowick era, and it was when Jonathan Grenard welcomed rookie tight end Cade Stover to the NFL. Now, if CJ Stroud would have been able to alter the pass protection and not have a rookie tight end on a Pro Bowl edge rusher in his third career game, then maybe the result changes. And I don't want to get too much into the hypothetical of, well, what if CJ could have changed the pass protection in week 9 in the third quarter with 2 minutes left, and when it was a 3rd and 7, and if they convert this, then it changes the momentum and they all of a sudden win 6 straight games, and you get the point. I don't want to get into that conversation, but there are specific plays throughout the year that you wonder how much would have changed throughout the season if CJ had been given the authority to change pass protection pre-snap, and how much that would have altered the Texans season. I don't think they would have won the Super Bowl by any means, but that is a question now that we are in the offseason that is certainly worth wondering. One of my other big concerns that I have with the 2025 Texans, aside from the offensive line, is are the skill players going to be enough of a supporting cast for CJ Stroud, and Nico Collins for that matter, to make a deep run in 2025? And I mean go to the AFC Championship game. I have no concerns or questions about Nico Collins. He is one of the best receivers in the NFL. And by the way, I do want to credit the Texans front office and Nick Caserio for getting several contracts done before they would have increased their market value significantly. Nico Collins is one, Derek Stingley is another because he got paid before Sauce Gardner gets paid, and obviously whenever a player gets paid, then you know it's the next guy that's going to top the previous contract, and they signed Derek Stingley as fast as they could have to a contract extension because they have to be completed their 3rd season prior to receiving the 2nd contract, so good for Nick Caserio for doing a lot of things right. But I don't think Christian Kirk is going to come in and be this 1,000-yard player and turn the clock back to what he was a couple of years ago. Christian Kirk at his best was really a wide receiver too, and he was given a bag by the Jags back in the 2021-2022 offseason, and he had to do what was best for himself and ultimately his family. And I will never say that a player should not take a big contract when the money is in front of them, but I don't think Christian Kirk is going to be this wide receiver too, where we have legitimate conversations about Nico Collins and Christian Kirk being a top 3 or top 5 receiving duo in 2025. I also worry about Joe Mixon aging because he is 29, and I know he had a good year last year, but he is certainly at the point in his career, given that he was drafted all the way back in 2017, that we are on a year-by-year basis with Joe Mixon. And I know a lot of people haven't talked about the running back position being a big need for the Texans in the 2025 draft, because obviously offensive line and wide receiver dominate the draft takes for the Texans, but I really think the Texans are going to take a running back fairly early in the 2025 draft, and probably a lot earlier than you may think. My biggest concern with the 2025 Texans offense is not being enough when it comes hell or high water against the elite of elite teams, and then also playing in a division that in theory you should win, and why that may not be as fortunate for them as you may think. Now, when we talk about the divisions teams are in, we usually talk about how the other elite teams in the division could, or in some cases do, hinder teams' progress because of how much of a roadblock they are to get around. And I look at a team like the Browns, who are in a division with the Bengals and Ravens, and can only try to fathom how much of a pain in the rear end it will be to have to play Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson for a quarter of your schedule for effectively the next 6 to 7 years, and possibly even longer. But the AFC South isn't like that, as the quarterbacks outside of CJ Stroud at the moment are Trevor Lawrence, Anthony Richardson, and or Daniel Jones, and we might as well say Cam Ward. Trevor Lawrence himself is another good example of a guy not living up to the expectations he once had, and I'm not entirely out on Trevor Lawrence and think that he's a draft bust or anything out of the ordinary like that, but I also think it's fair to say he has been a disappointing player from what the Jags were expecting when they drafted him out of Clemson back in 2021. Obviously, Trevor was set up to fail in 2021, but players have bad rookie seasons, and I am a firm believer that if you were that good to begin with, you could overcome a bad season, even as bad as 2021 was with Urban Meyer and the horrific receiving core he had, and be the guy you were expected to be. And in 2022 with Doug Peterson, they won a playoff game, which was the start of what was to be expected from Trevor Lawrence and the Jags. But things turned south for Jacksonville after starting out 8-3 in 2023, and they fired Doug Peterson after going just 4-13 in 2024, and we'll see how things go with new head coach Liam Cohen. Indy obviously has their problems with Anthony Richardson, and we've dove into those problems several times on the channel before, but my biggest thing with Indy is I don't think they're going to beat the Texans when it matters, based on where they are currently, especially with how good the Texans' defense is. I'm not going to spend too much time in Tennessee because they are clearly rebuilding, and you don't accidentally stumble into the number 1 overall pick, and while I do like Cam Ward as a prospect, I do not think the situation he is walking into as a rookie is great, especially from a receiving core standpoint. And I know you may be thinking, these are not bad things for the Texans, especially given they are in a bad division, and given that they can very easily three-peat to win the AFC South to start CJ Stroud's career. But one of the biggest things I worry about with the Texans specifically is, as simple as this question is, how do we get to the next level to the point where we can challenge the Baltimores, the Buffaloes, and the Kansas Cities of the world when it matters most? And I fully acknowledge the Texans played up in the postseason, especially with a dominating 20-point win over the Chargers, and by outgaining the Chiefs by over 120 yards and winning the time of possession battle in the divisional round. And I also know there were multiple calls Texans fans didn't agree with in this game, rightfully so might I add, but now that the Texans have a high floor, and now that they have the culture established with DeMeco Ryans and CJ Stroud, and Will Anderson for that matter, how do they take the next step as a football team and not get beat by Baltimore 31-2 at home 2 weeks before the playoffs start, especially with the offensive line concerns they have heading into the season, and especially with a first-year offensive coordinator in Nick Caley, who is coming over from the Rams after being their tight ends coach and pass game coordinator in 2024. I have no questions about a healthy CJ Stroud and Nico Collins regarding the Texans offense, but where I do have questions effectively is the remaining 9 starters on offense, as well as a first-time play caller in 2025. Now, if you've noticed one thing throughout this video, it's that we haven't talked about the Texans defense that much entering 2025, really aside from the mention of the Derek Stingley contract extension, and it's because I really like this unit. If there's one position I think they should address on defense entering the 2025 draft, it's the defensive tackle position. I think their defensive tackles are a little underwhelming relative to the rest of the defense, and you guys know how much I love the fire hydrant defensive tackles, and we discussed the fire hydrant defensive tackles the other day in the 49ers video, whether it's Tyleik Williams from Ohio State, Jordan Phillips from Maryland, or even Jamari Caldwell from Oregon. I would be a fan of any of those players from the Texans because you also have to stop the run in the AFC, whether it's Derrick Henry running at you, whether it's a combination of Josh Allen and James Cook and also Lamar Jackson to go back to Derrick Henry. The point is if you are going to go to the Super Bowl in this conference, you have to stop the run at some point, specifically along the interior. So if you wanted to go with an interior defensive lineman, by all means, go for it. Any of those 3 guys also apply to the Texans. But the Texans right now have 4 picks in the top 100 of the 2025 draft, and I wouldn't be against them trading up at all. And I know there's a big gap between where they selected pick 89 and pick 166 between day 2 and day 3, but the reality is the teams selecting directly in front of them in the first round and the Minnesota Vikings have pick 24, and they only have 4 picks in the 2025 draft. Everybody knows this, and everybody knows they are a prime team to trade back. So there is a reality where a team like the Kansas City Chiefs, who have picks 31, 63, and 66 thanks to the L'Jarius Sneed trade from last year, where they used 31 and 66, or maybe even a combination of other picks, to trade directly in front of the Texans to go up and get an offensive lineman. So with that being said, I wouldn't be opposed at all for the Texans to go up and get somebody like Kelvin Banks from Texas. You guys know I really like Kelvin Banks from Texas, or even Gray Zabel from North Dakota State. One way or another, I think the offensive line has to be addressed early and often in the 2025 draft for Houston, as well as the receiver position. With the Texans' offensive line consisting of guys like Cam Robinson, Titus Howard, Laken Tomlinson, Jarrett Patterson, Juice Scruggs, and a combination right tackle of Trent Brown and Blake Fisher, I do want to point out the possibility of them drafting a player that CJ Stroud is familiar with in the first round in Emeka Egbuka. Egbuka would be a great complement to Nico Collins, who is your typical big-bodied X-receiver, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if Egbuka had a 750 or 800 yard rookie season and would eventually be a 1,000 yard guy. Think of this as a Kevin Walter to Andre Johnson type comparison from way back in the day, and Texans fans of course remember that. I did want to point that possibility out because I don't want this idea of the Texans being locked into drafting an offensive lineman in the first round no matter what, especially if the value isn't there. If they wanted to trade up for an offensive lineman that may fall, well, like we said, they have the draft capital as they have 4 selections in the top 89, and the reality is, and the way that I think this front office will think, is they're only a piece or two away from legitimately competing. I know they don't pick till pick 166 on day 3, but again, if they wanted to trade pick 166 and maybe a 6th or a 7th next year to go up to maybe 130 or 140 to go get one of the talented running backs in this class, maybe like a Bajol Tutin, or even let a player like Ollie Gordon fall to them on day 3, I would also be fine with that. Ultimately, my dream for the Texans 2025 draft is to walk out in some capacity, and again, this would involve a trade up with guys like Gray Zabel and Emeka Egbuka in the first and early part of the second round, and then ultimately drafting a guy like Bajol Tutin on day 3, or Ollie Gordon for that matter if you wanted a power back on day 3, as well as a run-stuffing defensive tackle to be able to come in and play the early downs. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, please like and subscribe as we are closing in on 200,000 subscribers, and I cannot thank you guys enough for the support. Until next time, as always, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.